The late summer of 1828 settled over Virginia's Tidewater region with an oppressive humidity that made even the simplest movements exhausting, the air so thick with moisture from the James River and its tributaries that genteel white families retreated to their most elegant parlors while enslaved workers labored in conditions that turned fields and workyards into furnaces of human suffering. In the slave quarters of Riverview Estate, one of the oldest and most prestigious plantations in the region 20 miles downriver from Richmond, household servants gathered in the evening darkness and spoke in voices carefully calibrated to avoid detection, discussing an extraordinary purchase that had just been completed, a man so tall he had to stoop to enter even the quarter's highest doorways. Acquired not by the master for any practical agricultural purpose, but at the absolute and unyielding insistence of the mistress for reasons that seemed to have everything to do with social vanity and nothing to do with estate operations. According to local legend, this wasn't simply another transaction in the endless commerce of human flesh that sustained Virginia's declining agricultural economy as it transformed into a breeding ground for the domestic slave trade. This was a purchase that would expose the particular dynamics of power within the Tidewater aristocracy's oldest families, revealing how white women's obsessions with lineage, social standing, and the elaborate rituals of elite entertainment could shape enslavement in ways as cruel and capricious as anything their husbands imposed. Fragmentary records suggest that what unfolded over the next 16 months would become a story whispered across the Upper South, a tale of how ancestral pride, competition among Virginia's first families, and the peculiar psychology of domestic slavery in the Commonwealth's most established households could combine to create circumstances where someone purchased as a living monument to family greatness would become a challenge that exposed every contradiction in the refined household operations that Tidewater's plantation mistresses had perfected across generations. Virginia's Tidewater region in the late 1820s represented the heartland of American slavery's oldest aristocracy, a landscape where families traced their lineages to colonial governors and royal land grants, where fortunes built on tobacco cultivation across generations had created a self-conscious elite that measured itself against European nobility and claimed a refinement that distinguished their approach to human bondage from the crude brutality of newer slave states. The region's economy had been in decline for decades, as soil exhaustion from intensive tobacco cultivation reduced yields and forced planters to either shift to less profitable wheat and corn production, or to recognize that their most valuable asset was no longer land but the enslaved people who worked it. This recognition had transformed the Tidewater into a primary source of human beings for the domestic slave trade, with thousands sold south and west annually to feed the insatiable labor demands of the expanding Cotton Kingdom, tearing apart families and communities that had existed for generations to service debts and finance the conspicuous consumption that Tidewater aristocrats believed their social position required. Richmond had become the commercial center for this trade in human beings, with slave markets operating openly near the docks where the James River met ocean-going commerce. Their advertisements in newspapers discussing people with the casual commercial language used for livestock, while simultaneously claiming that Virginia slavery was more humane and civilized than the brutal operations of Mississippi or Alabama. The society that maintained this system operated through elaborate social mechanisms that distinguished Tidewater aristocracy from both yeoman farmers who owned few or no enslaved people, and from the nouveau riche planters of the Deep South, whose wealth exceeded the old families, but whose lineages lacked the pedigree that Virginia's first families obsessed over. Household service in the Tidewater had been refined across generations into an elaborate choreography of deference and display, with enslaved people trained from childhood in the specific roles and behaviors that supposedly demonstrated slavery's civilized character, while actually serving to validate white families' claims of superiority and genteel refinement. The legal structures governing Virginia slavery in 1828 reflected 2 centuries of legislative development, creating one of the most comprehensive slave codes in the world, even as enforcement varied across different regions and social classes. Enslaved people were defined as chattel property subject to their owners' absolute control, forbidden from learning to read, from gathering without white supervision, from traveling without written passes, from testifying against white people in legal proceedings. A comprehensive apparatus of control, refined through generations of experience, managing a black population that had historically outnumbered whites in many Tidewater counties. Free black people existed in the region in significant numbers, perhaps 15,000 by 1830, but under crushing restrictions that required registration. prohibited certain occupations and subjected them to constant surveillance by patrols authorized to question anyone appearing to be of African descent about their legal status and right to move freely. Into this world of codified oppression disguised as aristocratic refinement came someone who would demonstrate that Tidewater slavery's elaborate claims of paternalistic care and civilized household management could mask cruelty as arbitrary and destructive as anything the system produced anywhere. The contradiction was inherent in the structure. White women from Virginia's first families possessed enormous practical authority over household operations and enslaved domestic workers while remaining legally subordinate to their husbands. Unable to own property in their own names or exercise independent legal agency, channeling their intelligence and ambitions into the only arena where they could wield absolute power. The management of household servants whose training and deployment reflected directly on the mistress's competence and the family's claim to genteel status. Stories passed down through generations claim that O.C. arrived at Riverview Estate in August 1828, purchased at a Richmond slave market, not because the estate owner needed his labor, but because his wife had demanded his acquisition after seeing him displayed during what should have been a routine trip to sell wheat and tobacco from the previous harvest. The circumstances of this purchase revealed dynamics that shaped Tidewater slavery in ways that official records rarely captured, but that profoundly affected enslaved people's experiences in the region's oldest and most prestigious households. According to oral histories, Penelope Randolph, whose family claimed descent from one of Virginia's colonial governors, and whose marriage to Thomas Randolph had united two of the Tidewater's most distinguished lineages, had accompanied her husband to Richmond that day on what was supposed to be straightforward business: selling agricultural products, purchasing supplies, and perhaps attending to some routine financial matters with the family's merchants and creditors. But when Penelope saw Osei standing on the auction block in Richmond's Shockoe Bottom Market, 7 feet and 6 inches tall, with a physique that suggested both tremendous strength and a kind of noble bearing that even the degrading rituals of the slave market couldn't completely suppress, she had insisted immediately, and with an intensity that shocked witnesses, that her husband purchase him regardless of price or practical utility. The bidding that followed became something of a spectacle in Richmond, with Thomas Randolph competing against several other buyers at his wife's relentless direction, her voice carrying across the crowded market as she ordered him to continue bidding no matter what others offered, making clear that this acquisition was not negotiable and that she would accept no outcome except securing ownership of this extraordinary individual. He finally won the bidding at an astronomical sum, $2,400, more than triple what prime-field hands typically cost, and a price that represented nearly half of Riverview's annual net revenues in a year when tobacco prices had been depressed and wheat yields disappointing. Oral histories preserved multiple explanations for Penelope Randolph's determination to acquire Osei, despite the economically irrational price and Riverview's limited need for additional labor, given the estate's declining agricultural productivity. Some accounts suggested that her motivations were rooted in pure vanity and the obsessive status competition that characterized relationships among Tidewater aristocratic women, claiming she wanted to own the most extraordinary enslaved person available as proof that the Randolph family remained among Virginia's absolute elite, despite economic pressures threatening many old families' continued preeminence. Others hinted at more specific social dynamics, suggesting that a rival family, the Harrisons, whose estate bordered Riverview and whose own lineage claims competed with the Randolphs for recognition as among the Commonwealth's most distinguished, had recently acquired an unusually tall household servant, and that Penelope Randolph absolutely refused to be outdone in any contest involving visible demonstrations of family wealth and status. A few whispered versions of the story suggested even more complex psychological dimensions, hinting that Mrs. Randolph's insistence reflected anxieties about the family's declining fortunes and her desperate need to maintain appearances of continued prosperity and grandeur, even as the economic foundations of that grandeur eroded beneath debts and declining agricultural revenues. And that owning someone as extraordinary as Osei represented a kind of defiant assertion that the Randolphs remained supreme among Virginia's first families, regardless of what account books might suggest. Whatever the true motivations, what seemed clear from all accounts was that Osei was purchased not for any rational economic purpose related to Riverview's tobacco and wheat production, but to satisfy the mistress's psychological needs in ways that had nothing to do with estate productivity and everything to do with maintaining status and supremacy in the elaborate social hierarchies that consumed the lives of Tidewater aristocratic women. Thomas Randolph completed the purchase with obvious reluctance and barely concealed anger about being pressured into an acquisition that made no economic sense for an estate struggling with debts and declining revenues. But his wife's social standing, her Randolph lineage combined with her birth family's equally distinguished pedigree, and his own unwillingness to engage in public marital conflict that would reflect badly on both families, meant he authorized the transaction despite recognizing it as financially reckless and practically problematic. What neither Penelope nor Thomas Randolph anticipated, what their different forms of calculation prevented them from recognizing, was that they had purchased someone whose extraordinary physical presence would make traditional deployment impossible, whether in agricultural labor or the refined household service that Tidewater aristocracy had perfected across generations. O.C.'s height meant he was fundamentally unsuited for fieldwork. His size would make him conspicuous and difficult to supervise effectively, and his obvious extraordinariness suggested he was too valuable to risk in agricultural labor that might injure or damage such a costly acquisition. But he was equally unsuited for the household service roles that Penelope Randolph had envisioned, his presence too dominating and visually unsettling to serve the subtle demonstrations of refined taste and aristocratic superiority that elite entertaining required. The rhythm of life at Riverview Estate followed patterns established through generations of Tidewater plantation operations, elaborate routines that distinguished between field workers who labored in declining tobacco and wheat cultivation, and the extensive household staff who maintained the main residence and served the Randolph family according to protocols refined across decades to demonstrate the family's claim to aristocratic status. The main house, a Georgian mansion built in the 1740s when tobacco money flowed freely and Virginia's Tidewater seemed destined for permanent prosperity, required constant maintenance and operated according to hierarchies as complex as any European noble household. Penelope Randolph managed household operations with obsessive attention to every detail, viewing domestic service as the primary arena where she could demonstrate the superior training, refinement, and taste that supposedly distinguished the Randolphs from lesser families, including the nouveau riche planters of the Deep South, whose wealth might exceed the old Tidewater families, but whose lack of multi-generational pedigree marked them as inferior. O.C. worked in this environment from his first day at Riverview, initially assigned to duties that Penelope Randolph believed would showcase his extraordinary height, while also providing some practical utility and demonstrating her superior judgment in recognizing his potential value. She envisioned deploying him in roles that would make his size visible during the elaborate entertainments through which Tidewater aristocratic families maintained social relationships and competed for recognition of their continued preeminence. But scattered documents hint that from the very beginning, these assignments created complications that neither Randolph understood or knew how to resolve within the constraints that elite Tidewater society and its elaborate protocols imposed. Local tradition holds that the first serious crisis occurred in September 1828, barely a month after O.C.'s arrival, during what should have been Penelope Randolph's triumphant display of her new acquisition at an elaborate dinner party, hosting several of Virginia's most distinguished families, including representatives of the rival Harrison family, whose own acquisition of a tall household servant had initially sparked Mrs. Randolph's determination to purchase someone even more extraordinary. Tidewater aristocratic entertaining operated according to rules refined across generations, with every detail of household service, table settings, food presentation, and social choreography reflecting on the mistress's competence and the family's claim to elite status. Penelope Randolph had planned this particular gathering for weeks, intending it to demonstrate that the Randolphs remained supreme among Virginia's first families, and that her judgment in acquiring O.C. had been vindicated by his contribution to the evening's magnificence. She had assigned O.C. to serve as principal footman, positioning him prominently in the dining room where his extraordinary height would create impressive visual impact and demonstrate that Riverview could afford acquisitions that exceeded anything rival families possessed. But the evening proved catastrophic in ways that exposed the fundamental miscalculation underlying his purchase and the impossibility of incorporating someone of his size into the subtle demonstrations of refined taste that elite Tidewater entertaining required. When guests entered the dining room and encountered O.C. standing at his assigned position, their reactions ranged from shocked stares to barely concealed discomfort to comments that, while phrased with aristocratic indirection, clearly communicated that his presence was inappropriate and disturbing, rather than impressive. His extraordinary height meant that rather than fading into elegant background as well-trained footmen were supposed to do, He dominated the room so completely that guests found it difficult to focus on anything else. His head was well above the other servants, his massive frame making the carefully proportioned Georgian dining room feel somehow distorted and wrong, his very presence creating a spectacle that was more circus-like than refined. Some guests made oblique comments about the vulgarity of such ostentatious display, suggesting that true aristocratic taste involved subtlety and restraint rather than spectacular exhibitions. Others seemed genuinely unsettled by his size, as if his physical presence suggested some kind of primitive force or disorder that violated every principle of civilized refinement that the evening was designed to demonstrate. The Harrison family representatives in particular made pointed observations that such an acquisition seemed more appropriate for Deep South planters obsessed with crude displays of wealth than for a family of the Randolphs' distinguished lineage and supposedly superior taste. What happened after the guests departed, according to oral histories preserved across generations, revealed the particular cruelty that Tidewater slavery enabled when white women from the most prestigious families channeled their social humiliation and rage into treatment of people they controlled absolutely. Penelope Randolph, devastated by the gathering's failure and the implicit criticism from other aristocratic families, whose approval she desperately needed to maintain her own sense of status and worth, blamed O.C. entirely for the disaster. She ordered him brought to the estate's punishment area, a small outbuilding deliberately located away from the main house so that the reality of violence wouldn't disturb the genteel facade, and supervised personally as overseers administered a whipping with severity that shocked even workers accustomed to plantation brutality. The beating was savage enough to leave Osei barely able to stand afterward, brutal enough that permanent scars would mark his back for whatever remained of his life, extreme enough that even Thomas Randolph reportedly expressed concern that his wife's rage might have permanently damaged extraordinarily expensive property. But Penelope Randolph's fury wasn't satisfied by physical punishment alone. Oral traditions claim she ordered that O.C. be given the most degrading and difficult household tasks for weeks afterward: cleaning chamber pots, scrubbing floors, performing labor that emphasized his reduction to the status of the lowest servants despite the enormous sum spent to acquire him. This deliberate humiliation represented a kind of psychological torture designed to punish him for failing to serve purposes he had never been consulted about and could never control, for existing in ways that had attracted criticism rather than the admiration she had desperately anticipated. The fall and winter of 1828 brought escalating tensions at Riverview, as Penelope Randolph struggled to find any use for Osei that would justify his enormous purchase price, while also satisfying her need to extract some return on an acquisition that had become a source of profound embarrassment among the very families whose approval she most craved. She attempted various household roles, assigning him to tasks that ranged from maintenance work to service positions, but none proved workable within the constraints his extraordinary height imposed and the social dynamics his presence created. When assigned to visible household service during social gatherings, he disrupted rather than enhanced the subtle demonstrations of refined taste that Tidewater entertaining required. When assigned to maintenance work out of public view, his deployment represented a tacit admission that $2,400 had been spent on someone fundamentally unsuited for the purposes he had been acquired to serve. Whispered tales speak of Penelope Randolph's treatment of Osei during this period as exemplifying the worst aspects of the power that white women from Virginia's oldest families wielded over enslaved people they claimed to care for with paternalistic benevolence. She began finding fault with everything he did, inventing infractions that justified punishments administered to satisfy her psychological need to assert control over someone whose very existence reminded her of catastrophically poor judgment that had damaged her standing among the families whose approval defined her sense of worth and identity. She would order him to perform impossible tasks calibrated to his size, working in spaces too small for his frame, carrying loads balanced in ways that required shorter stature, moving through areas where his height made passage dangerous or impossible, and then have him punished when he inevitably failed, using these failures as justification for violence that served no productive purpose, but satisfied her need to exercise absolute power over someone who had become the embodiment of her social humiliation. Other household servants at Riverview watched these interactions with growing horror, recognizing that Osei was being systematically destroyed not for any actual inadequacy, but because his presence had become intolerable to a mistress who couldn't admit error without acknowledging that her judgment was fallible and that the Randolph family's claim to superior refinement might be hollow. The elaborate household hierarchies that governed Tidewater domestic service meant that other enslaved workers understood exactly what was happening. Mrs. Randolph was using Osei to work through her own rage and humiliation, treating him as an object upon which she could vent frustrations that her position as a woman in aristocratic society gave her no other outlet for expressing. By spring of 1829, fragmentary records suggest that Thomas Randolph had begun to recognize that his wife's insisted purchase had created a crisis threatening both Riverview's already precarious finances and the family's standing among Virginia's first families whose approval remained essential for maintaining social and economic relationships. The $2,400 spent on Osei represented capital that could have been used to service debts that threatened the estate's continued operation, to purchase multiple productive field workers, or to make improvements that might have increased agricultural revenues. Instead, the money had been spent on someone who served no useful purpose and whose presence had become a source of ongoing embarrassment that damaged the Randolph family's reputation among the very families they most needed to impress. Other Tidewater planters had begun making pointed observations about the Randolphs' judgment and household management, comments delivered with the oblique indirection that characterized aristocratic criticism, but clearly communicating that the family had made a costly mistake that reflected badly on their competence and taste. Thomas Randolph, facing mounting pressure from creditors increasingly nervous about the estate's ability to service debts, and from social peers whose approval he needed to maintain business relationships and marriage prospects for his children, concluded that the situation required resolution regardless of the additional financial loss that selling Osei would entail. Local tradition holds that matters came to a head in May 1829 during an incident that would become legendary among enslaved communities throughout the Tidewater, and that would haunt the Randolph family's reputation for years afterward. According to these accounts, Penelope Randolph insisted on bringing Osei to an elaborate wedding celebration at a neighboring estate, determined to demonstrate that she had not made a mistake in purchasing him and that he could serve the purposes she had envisioned if properly deployed. The wedding brought together Virginia's most distinguished families in a display of aristocratic magnificence designed to demonstrate the Tidewater elite's continued prosperity and refinement, despite economic pressures threatening many old families' fortunes. Penelope Randolph positioned Osei prominently among the Riverview household servants attending the Randolph family, intending his presence to prove that her judgment had been sound, and that those who had criticized the acquisition simply lacked the vision to recognize his value. But the afternoon proved utterly catastrophic in ways that exposed how completely she had misunderstood what his presence meant within the social dynamics of Tidewater aristocratic society. Rather than admiring Osei as an impressive acquisition demonstrating the Randolphs' continued preeminence, other families treated his presence as confirmation that Penelope Randolph's judgment was questionable, and that perhaps the family's claim to superior taste and refinement was less secure than their lineage suggested. Whispered conversations among plantation mistresses reportedly focused on the vulgarity and inappropriateness of such an ostentatious display, with pointed comparisons to Deep South planters whose crude pursuit of spectacular acquisitions demonstrated their lack of true aristocratic refinement. The Harrison family in particular made cutting remarks about how the Randolphs seemed to have forgotten that genuine elite status was demonstrated through subtle taste rather than obvious spectacle. Penelope Randolph, confronted with the reality that her expensive acquisition had permanently damaged rather than enhanced her standing among the women whose approval she desperately craved, reportedly left the celebration early and returned to Riverview in a state of rage and humiliation that would have devastating consequences for Osei. What happened after their return, according to oral histories preserved for generations, revealed the absolute cruelty that Tidewater slavery enabled when white women from the most privileged families possessed unchecked power over people who had no means of protecting themselves or escaping the consequences of their owners' psychological pathologies. Penelope Randolph, her entire sense of identity and worth shattered by the public confirmation that her judgment had been catastrophically flawed, blamed Osei completely for the disaster, not for anything he had done, but simply for being what she had demanded he be, for existing in ways that had attracted criticism and mockery, rather than the admiration she had convinced herself would vindicate her decision. She ordered him brought to the punishment area and supervised as overseers administered a beating so severe that witnesses feared he might die from the injuries. The violence was extreme enough that Thomas Randolph reportedly intervened to prevent further damage to expensive property, creating a confrontation between husband and wife that exposed tensions their marriage had contained for years. According to multiple oral accounts, Thomas Randolph told his wife that her insistence on purchasing Osei had been a mistake from the beginning, that 9 months of systematic cruelty had accomplished nothing except destroying valuable property and damaging the family's reputation, and that he would no longer tolerate her treatment of someone whose continued presence was bankrupting the estate financially and socially. Penelope Randolph reportedly responded with fury, claiming that as the person who had insisted on the purchase, she had primary authority over Osei's management, accusing her husband of undermining her standing among other plantation mistresses, and threatening to appeal to her birth family, whose wealth and influence exceeded the Randolphs in some respects, if he prevented her from exercising what she viewed as her rightful power. The confrontation escalated in ways that made clear the Randolph marriage had been strained by Osei's presence, that his purchase had exposed conflicts between husband and wife about money, judgment, and authority that predated his arrival, but that his extraordinary nature had made impossible to continue ignoring. Thomas Randolph, facing both his wife's rage and the stark economic reality that Riverview's continued operation was threatened by debts that the estate's declining agricultural revenues couldn't service, made a decision that resolved the immediate crisis while exposing the fundamental bankruptcy of Tidewater aristocracy's claims about paternalistic care and rational estate management. He announced that Osei would be sold immediately, that he would accept whatever price was available to eliminate the problem his wife's vanity had created, that the entire disastrous acquisition needed to end before it destroyed what remained of the family's finances, and standing among Virginia's first families. Penelope Randolph reportedly resisted this decision with a vehemence that suggested she had become psychologically invested in exercising power over Osei in ways that selling him would terminate. But Thomas Randolph insisted that the sale proceed regardless of his wife's objections or the additional financial loss it would represent. By June 1829, scattered documents hint that Thomas Randolph sold Osei to a slave trader for approximately $1,000, taking a catastrophic loss of $1,400 on a purchase that had lasted less than a year and had generated nothing but conflict, humiliation, and permanent damage to the family's reputation among the Tidewater elite, whose approval they desperately needed. What happened to Osei after this sale remains largely unknown, swallowed by the systematic gaps in historical records that characterize the domestic slave trade's operations, and the deliberate erasure of enslaved people's experiences in documents controlled by those who benefited from slavery's continuation. Some oral histories claim he was sold to a cotton plantation in Mississippi, where his extraordinary strength would be exploited until his body broke under labor designed to extract maximum productivity, regardless of long-term consequences. Others suggest he was purchased by a New Orleans merchant who employed him in commercial operations where his size remained valuable, but where the dynamics differed from the psychologically destructive household service he had endured at Riverview. A few accounts even claim that Osei died during transport to his new owner, his body finally succumbing to the months of systematic abuse that Penelope Randolph's rage had inflicted, becoming just another casualty of the domestic slave trade that killed thousands through violence, disease, and the trauma of forced separation. The truth, whatever it was, disappeared into the deliberate silence that characterized historical records of enslaved people's lives. What seems certain is that Osei's time at Riverview left permanent scars, physical marks from the savage beatings Penelope Randolph had ordered, but also deeper wounds from experiencing the particular cruelty of being purchased as a monument to family greatness and then systematically destroyed when he failed to serve purposes he had never been consulted about and could never fulfill. His story became part of the oral traditions that enslaved communities throughout the Tidewater preserved across generations, a tale that captured essential truths about how white women from Virginia's most privileged families could exercise power over household servants in ways as brutal as anything male slaveholders imposed, about how obsession with lineage and social standing could determine fates with consequences as devastating as any field labor's physical demands. The impact of Osei's story persisted long after his departure from Riverview, creating conversations that revealed anxieties about the particular dynamics of Tidewater aristocratic slavery and the power that plantation mistresses wielded over people they claimed to care for paternalistically. For enslaved communities in the region, the tale became evidence of how vulnerable people were to white women's vanities and social obsessions, how competition among Virginia's first families could destroy lives with casual cruelty that had nothing to do with victims' own actions or worth. For white society, particularly among aristocratic families, the story generated uncomfortable conversations about judgment, status, and the arbitrary exercise of power that slavery enabled even in households claiming the most refined and paternalistic approaches to human bondage. The deeper truth that Osei's story illuminates extends far beyond one individual's suffering. His experience reveals how Tidewater aristocracy's elaborate claims of paternalistic refinement could mask cruelty as arbitrary and destructive as any system produced. How white women's obsession with maintaining status among Virginia's first families could manifest in violence against people powerless to resist. And sometimes, according to the legends that communities preserved when official history erased them, that cruelty stood 7 feet 6 inches tall, purchased to prove family greatness. Destroyed when reality failed to match aristocratic fantasy, sold away at devastating financial loss when continued presence became intolerable. Reminder that even Virginia's oldest family's claims of superior judgment and refined taste were hollow fictions masking the arbitrary brutality at slavery's heart.